Hello and welcome back to Venshon Denshon, my YouTube channel. Today, it's my enormous pleasure to have my good friend Fabian Russell as my guest. And as you'll hear, Fabian has had an exceptional career as an instrumentalist, conductor, and educator. And welcome to the channel, Fabian.
Geoff, thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. And I think normally I ask about memorable performances to start with, but because at the time of recording, you've just had a pretty memorable week, I want to start there because in the last week, you did Symphony number 1 by Brahms, Symphony in a Day, where I was lucky enough to play. And then in the same week, you conducted the Australian Youth Orchestra and the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Shostakovich won with the Australian Youth Orchestra and Turnage Blood on the Floor with the Melbourne Symphony. What was that week like for you? Take us through that week from the Symphony in a Day until the AYO.
Okay, well, like most people in our business, or not just in the music business, in the wider community, our professional world had changed significantly over the last year. I've had practically no work. Given that almost everything that I do these days is centered around rehearsals and performances, virtually nothing has taken place since the last thing I did, which was the 10th of March last year at Annam for a rehearsal day of Don Juan and the Death and Transfiguration of Strauss. So it had been a long time coming, and I'd had sort of a bit of a sabbatical. In some respects, it was one of the most boring holidays of my life. But when we got together for the Brahms 1, that was on the back of a Brahms 2 that we had played a few weeks ago, which you had come out of retirement for to play second trumpet in. And I was amazed that I was actually able to convince you to do that. We were very, very excited that you were going to be playing. Those who knew of you, and a lot of the young players at that stage still didn't know much about this quasi-mythical figure that is Jeffrey Siegel. But anyway, so Brahms 2 was a really important we'll get together for all these musicians in Melbourne, none of them had played together in quite a long time. And because it was such a successful day, I figured, why not, let's do Brahms 1. And the only time I could possibly squeeze it in was just before I was to start with AYO on Easter Sunday. So we spent Easter Saturday as a side-by-side project with, as is usual the case with my orchestra projects, friends, colleagues from the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. In the past at Easter, we would bring together somebody from every orchestra in Australia to play, as being the professional mentor to preeminent young musicians, primarily from the Australian National Academy of Music and Melbourne University, the youth orchestras around the country. But because this was a symphony today, it was hard to invite somebody, say, from Perth or Adelaide to come for one day. In the past, usually at Easter, we would do these particular activities for 3 days. With the standard model of 2 full days of rehearsal, the general and a concert, as it would be in a professional situation. And that was the raison d'etre of the Orchestra Project in the first place, was to give young musicians the opportunity to experience what it would be like if they were playing in a professional situation. So when you've got players, musicians of the caliber of Sophie Rowell, sponsor master of the MSO, and Christopher Moore from the MSO, etc., etc. In the past, people like Max McBride and Fabian Russell from Queensland and Harry Bennett from Sydney, and far too many people to even actually name right now. But a young player having that opportunity just to sit next to or in this part of a section of or be behind somebody that they admire and look up to, and it's a terrific experience for these young people. We've been doing these now for well over for about 20 years. And so that one orchestra project of we did of Brahms 1, you were there yourself. It was a really terrific and enjoyable experience once again. So the next day I started with AYO and Shostakovich First Symphony, Ravel La Valse, and Debussy L'après-midi. Young orchestra playing together for the first time, and music camp usually goes for 2 weeks in Adelaide, but that couldn't happen this year So they moved it to Easter for it to be for an 8-day period. Normally there would be 2 full programs spread over those 2 weeks, but it had been truncated into 1 program for, as I said, 8 days with a performance on the last day. So much energy, so much enthusiasm, so much terrific spirit, and that was almost threatened to not take place because on earlier that week, I think on Monday or Tuesday, Victoria locked the border again to Queensland because of the 2 COVID cases that had been discovered on the previous weekend. So all these young musicians from Brisbane were no longer able to come to Melbourne. Fortunately, the Victorian government relaxed that on the Wednesday evening, and they were able to get here. I wasn't sure it was even going to be able to take place, and thank God that it did. We rehearsed very hard throughout that week, but 3 weeks ago, I was approached by the MSO to take on a project because a conductor, Lawrence Rennes, a Dutch conductor, who had to withdraw from his residency with the MSO because, of course, he couldn't get into the country. And I felt for Lawrence. I know him from a brief time that I spent with him in San Francisco some years ago, and I don't knew exactly how he felt because I've been in that situation for the last 12 months. Every time a gig was about to start, within a week or two, it would get cancelled. For once, I was on the receiving end of some good news to actually be engaged for an engagement of a work that I'd never heard before. I didn't know anything much about Turnish other than a piece that I'd played by him back in the early 2000s with Markus Stenz, which was The Three Screaming Popes, another work inspired by Francis Bacon painting. This time it was Blood on the Floor. I thought, okay, this shouldn't be too difficult. He writes hard music, I know that. So then I get the score, it's 280 pages of hell. And I've got 2 weeks to learn this on top of everything else that I had to be preparing for as well. And it was a big challenge, definitely. And returning to my old orchestra, the MSO, it's for any conductor to returning to somewhere where they'd spent, well, in my case, 15 years, and still had a lot of friends in the orchestra, and the responsibility was very clear to me that this was a really tough piece to bring off, not just for me, but for them. What they had to play was highly virtuosic, very complicated. The metrics in this piece, that not just the time changes, but it's a very complicated work in terms of it's the mood of it, the atmosphere, the subject matter, and the rest of it. Now I had to squeeze all the rehearsals in between what I had already committed to AYO, and I was never going to let them down because that's an organisation that's been extremely loyal to me for a very long time. So the managements worked together, and we worked, and the schedules were constructed so it was possible for me to do both. On the back of the Brahms, we also did a Brahms 2 during the week with AYO as well, just as a reading session, which was we needed it as a circuit breaker because we'd been playing all the same repertoire for about 4 or 5 days, and I wanted them to do some sight reading, something I feel that young musicians need to do a lot of, and more than ever, because the level of sight reading has sort of changed from my experience when I was younger, that's for sure. So we did this, and so yeah, it was 2 Brahms symphonies, Shostakovich, La Valse, the Prelude, the After, and the Faun, which was in many respects the hardest work on the program. None of them had ever played it before, and as you well know, that's the transparency of such a work and how putting it together properly is a big challenge. I had about 60 hours of conducting last week, 22 calls.
Can you talk a little bit about, there are a couple of things I'd like to dig into. First of all, your preparation for this massive score that you conducted with the MSO, and also a little bit about whether you had a consciously different approach with the musicians, with comparing your orchestra, the Orchestra Project, where you know most of the people really well and they're handpicked by you, the Australian Youth Orchestra, where you probably know quite a few of them, but it hasn't been chosen by you, and then going back to the Melbourne Symphony. So first of all, maybe talk about your preparation for this 280 pages of hell, as you call it, and then your different approaches within the same week to conducting these different ensembles.
With regards to the turnage, the first difficulty that I had was that the font of the printed score was not particularly legible. It was very hard to read the time signatures. And given that they changed virtually every bar, I had to sit down and make it clear every time change and my code as well. And it's not about marking up the score. That was the major marking up I do. I don't usually highlight any, I certainly never use any of those colored pens or any of that. I come to terms with the page and try to write as little on it as possible, but I had to deal with the time changes and the tough metronomic shifts, which were not so straightforward. There was plenty of them. And so in terms of that, it was about 100 hours I probably put into it, give or take, 5 or 10. I worked to a pretty strict schedule because I knew that I had limited time and I had other activities that I couldn't just completely let go. I really had to be as efficient as possible. So it was a very early starts of the day and late finishes. I was also completing a music editing job that I was doing for Richard Mills, which there was a deadline for that. So that's why I had to truncate my preparation for the turnage into 2 weeks. So 14 days. It was about 100 hours.
Does that involve sitting?
Still, I wish I'd had it by the time. Sorry, Geoff. Sorry.
Does that involve sitting at the piano, like when you're trying to learn how it all goes? Like how do you get the music into your brain?
It's a highly dissonant work, and my piano skills are not skillful enough to be able to do that. It's too, you have to absorb as much information that you possibly can from every single page. If I'd had the time, it'd be a page a day to do it really, really properly. For forensic analysis of every part and understanding every dot dash, the rhythms and the colours and the textures and the rest of it. But one would like the luxury of months preparation on a work such as this, but I didn't have that. So I had to do the best I possibly could in the smallest amount of time possible. Fortunately, I've done some pretty tough works over the years, and I've done a lot of Ligeti. I've done a lot of John Adams, and quite a bit of really difficult composers like Elliott Carter and Thomas Adès. That was some years ago. I did The Living Toys, and that was 4 or 5 months preparing for that one. So given I'd had the experience in the past, it was actually possible to be able to get close to getting it over the line.
The other advantage sorry, I think we've got a bit of a delay. The other advantage you have is that you have yourself a very clear beat. And I know from some people that were there playing in MSO that clarity helps a lot with a complex work like that. So that's another thing you had going for you. That just the clarity of your beat.
Well, I remember Daniel Harding talking about this very subject. He was doing a work by, it'll come to me, he was out to conduct Annam in 2019, and what was it? It could have been, it escapes me at the moment. It was a very complicated work. I don't think it was a piece of Brett's, but it was up there, and he was of the view that you don't try to do anything fancy and that you be absolutely pragmatic, and the first beat of the bar is extremely important to everybody.
Yeah. And it's actually Daniel Harding was the one who premiered Blood on the Floor. He was as far as I know, I think it was Håkan Hardenberger and John Wallace who played the solo trumpet parts, and I believe that he was the conductor, as far as I know. I'm
aware that he has a recording, but I didn't listen to his recording, and I certainly didn't listen to the Ensemble Modern recording either. I try to avoid doing that. Years ago, I was having to learn from the Canyons to the Stars in a short period of time, the Messiaen. And I didn't hear a recording of that, and I was glad I didn't. I think it's you've got a bit more integrity about you if you actually learn it from the score rather than just, winging it with a recording.
Yeah,
as tough as it is, it's a longer process, but I think it's the right thing to do.
Leads to it being more internalized, perhaps. So, going from your preparation for the turnage, what was your approach for these 3 different orchestras? Did you have a consciously different approach, or are you the same? Like like you're doing Brahms in one day with people you know really well, an intense week with these young musicians, and then with the professionals of MSO, which for people who don't know, Fabian was the solo tubist with that orchestra for 15 years, as he mentioned. So 3 very different situations. Do you have a consciously different approach to rehearsing with these orchestras?
With youth orchestras, my view has always been you need to treat them as though they are young professional musicians. You don't patronize them. Never talk down to them. You never get upset. You be extremely patient. And because I remember when I was younger, when I had experiences with one or two conductors who were exactly the opposite to that. And I learned from them about, in many respects, what not to do. So, and I don't need to expand on that, but that was with the youth orchestras. Your best result is when you run it like a professional rehearsal. And that is the first thing that happens in the first call is to play the whole piece through from beginning to end. And no matter what happens, you just keep going. Because at least if you've done that, by the time you get to the first performance, you've already played the work through once. And that's important because it's very easy to get bogged down with detail and to the point where they've had an orchestra hasn't played the piece through before you get to the concert. You know, less is more. You don't, if you talk too much, it can really an overload of information, micromanaging everything. You've got to give young musicians, you know, the respect and the patience to work things out for themselves. Of course, if that doesn't happen within a certain amount of time, you give them a hand to move them along. In the case of the MSO, well, obviously, you know, they're highly experienced, highly professional, they're proficient musicians, and they don't need anything that resembles a spoon feed whatsoever. Once again, with the Turnage, as a tougher piece as it is, we did go from the beginning of it for the next 80 minutes right to the end. We stopped once, so, and that was a bit of an achievement itself. I think we were all a bit surprised by that one, and then give them rehearse what needs to be done, and that's obvious. What in each rehearsal, what has to happen. You don't concentrate on minutiae. It's about big picture. You've got to get the clocks ticking away, and you can't get bogged down. You've got to keep everyone moving, playing, and as best you can, interested.
It's fascinating that you say that, because when I was in Zurich in the Tonhalle, our chief conductor was David Zinman, and without fail, the first thing we did was play it right through. And when he would teach conducting masterclasses, he would say the same thing: play the piece through and talk as little as possible.
Exactly. And that's what Dutoit did when we did the Rite of Spring with him in 87. 88. Do you recall when we were in Chatswood at the Arcadia Theatre?
I recall it very well.
and all the electricity went out in the building. And here we are, he's come to do his 2 weeks stint. He hadn't been, I think, in Australia for over 10 years. And we can't start the rehearsal, so we've been told to come back an hour later. And we began rehearsal. I remember him not actually using a score in the first rehearsal for the Rite.
Correct.
I remember he knew every rehearsal figure, every dot, every dash, and we played the whole damn thing through, right from the beginning to the end, where we didn't stop. And then he really coached the orchestra how to play the piece properly. He spoke quite a lot, but it was always very relevant, specific information. He didn't just waste any time whatsoever, and we went all the way to the last minute of each call.
What I recall is the way he put the Dan Sacral together, the way he taught the orchestra how to play. It was amazing. But before we go, we're gonna get to Dutoit soon, because before that, I would like you to talk a little bit about the Orchestra Project. So my personal experience has been, luckily, performing this Brahms 2 and Brahms 1 with you, and I absolutely loved it. The spirit of the orchestra was amazing. This mixture of really some of the very finest orchestral musicians in the country sitting there performing with some amazing students. The ambiance and the atmosphere was amazing, but that didn't just appear out of nothing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the genesis and some of you've done some huge repertoire with the Orchestra Project. So I want to give you just some free rein to talk about how did it come to be and a bit of the journey of the Orchestra Project.
The Orchestra Project started in 2002. It was basically a pilot episode. MSO had just come off the back of a side-by-side project with the Australian Youth Orchestra. We did Mahler 1 in the Maya Music Bowl here in Melbourne, and I was involved in the tutorials with AYO. I hadn't worked much with AYO over the years. I was a brass tutor at the 1992 National Music Camp, and a few of the music camps over the years as a tutor, and I hadn't had much to do with them. I'd been conducting a bit, but with a brass ensemble with lots of people that you know and that I know, and when they were youngsters, and I'd had certainly a big interest in conducting, and but I didn't expect that I was going to end up doing it professionally. I was a very content orchestral musician. Well, perhaps at that time I was becoming maybe a little bit more frustrated because I wasn't far away from being about, at that point, 17, 18 years of playing in orchestras. This side-by-side project was a terrific experience, I think, for the AYO musicians, but I thought it was for the MSO as well. Markus Stenz conducted it, and I found it a very enjoyable week of having these terrific young musicians working with us. And I was very well aware of the Sydney Symphony that Richard Gill had started some years before, and quite a few of our younger musicians who were getting jobs with us had gone through that training orchestra program with SSO. And I said, just in a conversation with Markus Stenz one day, I said, look, it's all well and good that we've, the SSO, they're training our future musicians. Why don't we just do it ourselves? And he said to me, Fab, if you want to give it a go, I'll give it my support. So I thought I'd just have a pilot program, and it was very ambitious on my part. I'd had a big interest in the Stravinsky and the Rite for a long time, and I'd been studying the score for years, and I always had wanted to conduct it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to put together an orchestra just for one day, and we're going to rehearse the Rite of Spring. And I'd got a bunch of my mates from the MSO to come and fill out the principal chairs, and we put together a really big orchestra of all these musicians from AM and Melbourne University, Melbourne Youth Orchestra, etc. And we did this in a day. And after 2 hours of rehearsal, we did a full run of the piece. And I did actually a full run to start with, and we got through it. And I was sort of surprised that I survived it, and it didn't crash, and I'd done a pretty good job of learning the piece by heart. I had the score there, of course, but I got the bug for it immediately. I thought, well, that was a lot of fun, and I'd like to do a little bit more of this. So I spoke to Markus, and he said, look, I'm going to get the MSO management to support this. Because I told him what the outcome of it was, and he wasn't there, none of them were there. It was a closed, informal concert that we had, and I asked him if he'd come and conduct Mahler 5 with the project later that year. And I said, if I'll do the preparations for you, then you'll come in and do one day of rehearsals and then a general on the concert. He completely agreed to that. He came in, he absolutely loved it. He had a terrific time. He says, well, I'll commit to doing this once a year with you. And so I was earning my stripes by being a rehearsal conductor. I did the same thing with Oleg Caetani as well. John Harding came and did a project when he was the director of ANAM. He came and did the Alpine Symphony. And after I did this for a few years, AYO had heard that I was doing this, and they needed a conductor to do the preparations for a really tough piece in Perth for the 2003 Perth Festival, and that was the Schoenberg Gurulita. And I got short notice of that because I was in Japan at the time doing a tour with Iwaki's Kanazawa Orchestra. And they got the score to me, and it was the middle of winter in Kanazawa, and you couldn't really walk down. It was just snowing. It was just the conditions were conducive to sitting in your hotel room and learning the Gurulita. So that's what I did, and I then flew out from Tokyo to Perth to get there in time to start the rehearsals, and the conductor they had was delayed further, and I remember having 4 good days on that piece. The concertmaster at that stage was Dale Baltra. The principal second violinist as a kid was Christian Winter. There's and loads of terrific musicians who occupy major positions in orchestra Australia were in that youth orchestra. The following year they were doing Mahler 2. And they asked me to come and do the rehearsals for that, for Benjamin Zander. And then a European tour that they were preparing for. So I became the go-to guy, it seemed to be doing preparations for guest conductors. I've done it with AYO now about 28 times.
Wow.
And got to a hell of a lot of repertoire under my belt. But going back to talk about the Orchestra Project, when Markus did this for a few years, so I mean, I patiently served an apprenticeship as an assistant conductor, and then I thought, well, I want to do a proper concert myself and do all the rehearsals and the concert with the Orchestra Project. And the MSO management were kind enough to continue to support this by giving me access to the Iwaki Auditorium and all the chairs and all the stands, and a bit of help from Alistair in the library and that to with their photocopy machine and the rest. And so I really wanted to do Shostakovich 7. So we put together a terrific orchestra, really terrific orchestra for it. And Shane Hooten came down. I think actually Shane may have already been in Melbourne by that stage, but he was the principal trumpet for it. We had a correct team brass players. Lin Zhang played first horn. He was still in high school at that stage, and Genevieve Clifford, she was 18. They were all basically children, but they really could play, these kids. I never say kids. They're these young musicians. They could really play, and we did it. So this was my first public concert, conducting a major work with an orchestra, and it was Shostakovich 7, a big one. Nearly crashed in the last movement at the beginning. Principal cello came in a barrier, and then the bassists did they're fine. And then we've got a split orchestra, and I thought, okay, this is my baptism of fire. This thing could crash any moment, but somehow we got when the trumpets came and moved back. So yeah, that was it. And then every year we would do 1 or 2 projects. The following year we did, I did my first Heldenleben. Christian Wedder played the solo violin. Lin Zhang played first horn, remarkable. Barry Tuckwell wanted to play 8th horn. So he came and played 8th horn, and I heard every single note he played. And even if he was in retirement, he hadn't played really seriously for years, but it was amazing to have him there, and all these young players there playing in a section with Barry Tuckwell. They just couldn't believe their luck.
Amazing.
We did the Master Singer Overture on the program as well.
Wow.
Later that year, Don Juan and Death and Transfiguration. I think you came to that.
I did. My wife Lauren was playing in the orchestra then. I came to that concert.
She played next to Caroline Emrys on the front. That's why I remember that. And yeah, so we would do these. We've pretty much doing them every year since. In recent years, we've Mahler 5, Mahler 6, Mahler 9, 4. The Brahms of later symphony in the days, but all the Mahlers I just mentioned. Then we would do these 3-day projects starting on Good Friday, 2 calls, Saturday, 2 calls, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon concert, and with some terrific support from a lot of people who just would give up their time to help me put this on, donate money to pay the bills, and the budget was always very, very small. We were never extravagant with our expenditure, that's for sure. And it made me realise this. You can put on some really big, successful, huge projects with orchestra. We're having 90 to 100 musicians involved in this for 3 days, and Anna was a terrific support to me. And our costs were so low, people just wouldn't believe it if I told them, how little it was. I mean, we're only talking a few $1,000s here, but some excellent patrons that believed in what we were doing and wanted to help.
That's amazing. I want to just highlight, and you're very humble about it, but this is a incredible contribution you've made to the education of, now it's literally hundreds of young musicians, of giving them the opportunity to play these major works. And as you say, under real conditions. Because often in a youth orchestra, you work on something for a whole term or for weeks and weeks and weeks. And this way that you've done it, where it's, okay, we're going to rehearse for 2 days, we'll have the general, and then we'll have the concert. And absolutely, I'm sure, an eye-opening experience for them, but also the opportunity to do it with seasoned professionals on the first chairs. So huge kudos to you for being able to bring in all of your professional friends to this situation. Now, Fabian, this opportunity you've given to others, I want to now pivot back to a time when we were given lots of opportunities. And I want to go back to the 80s, which was an amazing time to be a young musician in Sydney, that was where we first met. And maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about how you came at the age of 19 to be playing in the Sydney Symphony and what that was like for you, and some of the memorable concerts and experiences you had in those days.
Well, Geoff, you and I met in 1986. Was it before or actually during that Bolshoi ballet tour when we went to Canberra and Newcastle? Was it before that? I'm not quite sure.
We met in 1986. The Bolshoi that I did was in 1987 because I was at the con and I had to leave. In 1986, I was still in high school.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
1986. So we did meet at some point, I think in 1986, probably at a rehearsal of the Waverley Bondi Beach Band, that was conducted by, of all people, Cliff Goodchild. And Cliff was a huge supporter to me in giving me the encouragement to see that music as a profession was a possibility, because I wasn't considering it. I'd left school at the end of '85, and was doing an accounting towards a business degree, and I wasn't even going to go to university to study music. I think I had applied to go to the Sydney Con, and I auditioned on 2 instruments. I auditioned on tenor trombone, which I didn't really play a lot of, but I seemed to just play it every now and again for some reason, and the euphonium, not even the tuba at that stage. So I was going to go and possibly do a double major as a trombone euphonium. I played quite a bit of bass trombone in big bands. Not a lot, but actually, when I think about it, I did seem to be doing it a fair bit in my last year of high school. And just as by pure accident, my career has generally been one accident after another. But back in '85, I had a chance meeting with Warren Daly, who was the drummer from the Daly Wilson Big Band, and who I had known of. This was, it's a very famous jazz outfit, the most famous Australian jazz outfit of the day. I mean, Don Burrows was huge. James Morrison was still probably at high school at that stage, but it was this Daly Wilson Big Band. It had taken the world by storm. Here it was an Australian jazz group who were touring to Russia and China in the '70s, doing Cosmopolitan magazine centerfolds and being sponsored by Benson and Hedges. I mean, this was quite a unique outfit, and they were quite famous. Anyway, this drummer, I meet him because my brother's a witness in a car accident of which he was the innocent driver, and then somehow they get talking, and my brother tells him that I play bass trombone in big bands, and for some reason, God knows why, because he could have had access to anyone. He said, "Well, here's my number. Tell him to give me a call." And I went around to his place to do an audition on the bass trombone, borrowing a bass trombone from someone to take to this audition. And his wife, who was Karen Daly, who used to sell a diet. Her business was as a dietitian, and she was a former Miss Australia, and she was on the Bert Newton show every morning, trying to flog her book, this diet. So I met her. She introduces me and introduces herself to me and says, "Oh, Warren's waiting for you downstairs. I'll show you there." We go down. He puts it on a piece of music on the stand, and it says "A Train." A train. It doesn't commute to me that it's the A train. I read it as "A Train." So I'm doing my ta 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 ta, brass band jazz, and he knew that this guy has absolutely no idea. So then he says, "Look, I've got a bit of time. I'm going to give you a lesson." So he spends the next 2 hours on his drums giving me a jazz lesson. It was a revelation. It was such a generous thing for him to do, because maybe he thought this guy's maybe investing a little bit of time in, because he's fun. He sounds not bad. But that was about it, and then he gave me a couple of gigs
with the Warren Daly Band.
With the Warren Daly Big Band, not the Daly Wilson Band. This was the offspring from that, because him and Ed Wilson, their band had folded, I think, the year before. So here I was, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, the ability of these musicians was, I was just shocked. So that was great. But at that stage, I wasn't thinking about a jazz career or anything like that. I couldn't improvise. I couldn't do anything like that. But I had a big interest in big bands because of my obsession with Buddy Rich and Stan Kenton. And even Michael in one of your interviews were talking about, it was Jack Teagarden and all these, the golden age jazz musicians. And I was fascinated by people like Buddy Rich, by Max Roach, by Gene Krupa, by the rhythm section of these fabulous big bands and jazz combinations. But I didn't have any aspirations of being a jazz musician, but I learned a hell of a lot about rhythm from those guys. I mean, they were serious cats on their instruments. They were bosses. And I greatly looked up to them and was, slightly obsessed. But you talked about influences. Now, Cliff Goodchild, he sort of took me under his wing for a little while, and he said to me, "Well, if you're going to just remain as your euphonium player, you're going to die of starvation. There's no possible work there unless you want to go and play in the army band or the police band." He says, "But if you want to play an orchestra, you're going to have to either play the tuba or the trombone or the French horn." The French horn had always interested me. I had a lesson with Hector McDonald when I was 14. because a good friend of his, it was in the brass band that I played in, and he suggested I go and have a lesson from Hector, and I did that. I was very nervous going to see Hector because he'd had such a big reputation. I didn't know much about him, but I knew that he was a euphonium player before he was a French horn player. And I was a bit quiet, and I don't think he asked me questions, and I was genuinely nervous. And I think he might have thought I had an attitude problem, but I was genuinely just feeling quite intimidated by being in the presence of such a giant. It was only a one-off lesson, but he's very encouraging, extremely encouraging, in fact. And I never forget the time he gave up his time. It was between concerts with the ACO, with the Opera House. And I remember I was only 14 years of age, and he did that, and I never forgot him for that. Cliff liked coaching me on arbits. You know the intervals.
Intervals. Page 125.
Oh yeah, and he was good. It was very good, and he was tough. He was a tough teacher. He didn't put up with anything, any nonsense, and he'd give me hours of his time in his there in Bondi in the offices that they had there for the Sydney Band Festival.
Of course,
hours of his time. And Paul would come in occasionally and join in. It'd be a Goodchild lesson in stereo for both of them. And they actually believed in me. They thought I should consider doing this. And you'd played in the brass quintet with Paul, the Australian Brass Ensemble. Was that what it was called?
Australian Brass Quintet in those days. Yep.
And the following year, whatever he was either starting another quintet. He probably had two going. Paul was always very enterprising like that. And he invited me to play tuba in his brass quintet. And this was just before I started playing regularly with SSO. And it was Bruce Helmers on second trumpet, and two people who, such good fortune on my part to have met them and come under their musical spell, because they were so inspiring, the pair of them, for entirely different reasons. The trombonist was Timothy Dowling, and who was just such a great influence on me at that point. Such a terrific supporter, and I don't think I'd met anyone who loved music more than him. In the recordings that he introduced me to, he really knew his stuff. And the more I spoke to him, the more I realized that I knew nothing. And the other one, and he was probably a mentor, even still to this day, is Robert Johnson, who was the principal, as you know, the principal of the Sydney Symphony. And for your listeners, your viewers, Rob came down to play first horn in Brahms one last weekend.
And I just want to cut in here to say that my respect for Rob, when I was playing in the orchestra in the late 80s, he was a legend of horn playing. And to hear him now, 3 years after retiring, to come down and play an absolutely magnificent Brahms one,
I know, it was
blown away.
It was so good.
Yeah.
He played with our Orchestra Project in Sydney. We did our inaugural Sydney performance just on 18 months ago, where we played. Harry Bennett came and played the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. We did Mahler 4, and I asked Rob if he'd like to play with us, and he said yes immediately. And I mean, everyone was pretty shocked. He was well into retirement, pushing 70, and just playing in some ways more beautifully than I'd ever heard him play before. It was so inspiring and so impressive, and it reminded me what a first-class musician he is.
100% agree.
Something else. And he was so helpful to me when I started in the SSO, and he was the closest I had to a regular teacher while I was in the orchestra.
So how did you come to get that first go? What happened? How did you come to have that first crack at the SSO? What was the circumstance of that first concert?
The circumstances were clear, and I'm not being humble by saying this. They were totally desperate. They had no other options. Peter Wish-Wilson had been coming up from Adelaide to play with them regularly. He couldn't do it. There was somebody else that was booked for the gig. He double booked himself, and he couldn't get out because he had a work responsibility that he couldn't ditch. They didn't have anybody else at that stage that they could get. So, and I think Paul vouched for me because I'd already started playing in the quintet. I'm sure that Tim and and Rob must have as well. So they took a chance on me. And the first program was Gerald was conducting the Percy Granger Warriors, and there was a Prokofiev first violin concerto with von der Wielkomensky. And that was it. They did Schumann, of course, in the second half, which I wasn't involved in. And here I am for the first time playing in a major orchestra concert, and it just happens to be the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. And I didn't do youth orchestras when I was a kid. There was no orchestra program at the school that I went to. I had done one small engagement with the Sydney Trust, or what's called the Australian Opera Orchestra. The previous year was for a recording session, but it wasn't. There wasn't much involvement in that. There was only a couple of tracks that I was involved in. That's an interesting story, but I'll keep that one. I'll tell you about that one later. So here it is, and it's September 8th and 9th of 1987. I did my first 2 concerts with the Sydney Symphony, and I remember sitting there. I couldn't believe just how good this was. How just the energy of the place, the proficiency, having Danny Mendelow and that just sounding like, well, he was Yehudi trumpet. It was just astonishing. And that's the golden, fat, radiating, the glowing sound that I had not heard, been in the same room with somebody that could do that before. But the whole section as well. Ron was in top form. He played marvelously, I remember. And Russell Maddox, who'd been principal trombone himself for very many years on second, and Alan Mewett on bass. And Peter Wormsley, who I'd known since I was a kid through the brass bands, and Pete had always been a terrific supporter as well, and always, just one of they were the good guys. And Johnny Woods, we can't forget about him. Third trumpet. Previously, there's the associate principal trumpet during the days when Gordon Webb and John Robertson were the principal trumpets, and immediately from when I started there, because after this concert I'd done enough to impress them, whether I got put on a contract. And I got and that was for 1988, and at the bicentennial year of European settlement. And it was a big year for the SSO, really big year. In those days, we had 10 3-hour calls a week, and there'd usually be 2 full programs in a week. Incidentally, Robert Johnson had passed his trial the year before. They gave him the job after the first 2 weeks on the job, I think, because he had to play Mahler 5 and Heldenleben as his first 2 concerts with the SSO. A lot of concerts back then, a hell of a lot of concerts. In my first year with the SSO, I got to play Shostakovich 1, Shostakovich 5, 6, 9. In the Mahlers, in my first 2 years, 1, 3, 5, 6, 8, and Das Lied. Just in the first 2 years. And every single piece, like you, we were playing for the first time.
Absolutely.
I got very, very clear memories of your first rehearsal playing Sibelius too.
So do I.
And I've got very clear memories of my first rehearsal when Stuart was conducting me as well, playing the Ziegfeld's a funeral march from and the Magic Fire music from the end of Valkyrie. And yeah, I remember my first rehearsal with Stuart. Yeah. He gave me plenty of courage, that's for sure. But he was he was right. I was kilometers behind, miles behind. But still, all the repertoire that I got to do that year, doing the Rite for the first time, playing Petrushka for the first time, and the Firebird, playing Heldenleben, Dom 1. Help me here. There's quite. We did Death and Transfiguration that year as well. Salome's Dance, the Rosenkavalier, the Big Swede. So this is all in basically just such a short period of time. I mean, it was extraordinary, and everything we were playing, I was playing for the first time. I was so out of my depth.
And you know what? I used to go to those concerts, and you never ever sounded out of your depth to us. We used to go to all the concerts. I clearly remember the Shostakovich one. I clearly remember Mahler 6. I remember, of course, the ones I played in, but we would go, and you fit in. And it's not a small thing to say, because this was Dan Mendelow and Ron Prussing and Rob Johnson, the principals in full flight, and also Paul on associate principal. It was an amazing time to be playing in that orchestra, but also in the audience. I used to go to all those concerts, and I never once thought that you sounded out of your depth. You sounded absolutely magnificent. That's, I've always thought that.
That means a lot coming from you. But I felt at the start of the year, I'm out of my depth here. I don't know any of this music. I'm going to have to learn fast. And one thing I suppose that it was a good instinct to have, because but I've got to get all the scores to all these pieces, and I've got to start studying. It's January. I start at the end of this month, and everything I go there to play, I need to know really, really well. And fortunately, because Tim was such an audiophile, and I must say, Ron, I had a lesson with him once, and he showed me, he was very proud of his stereo system. He had an incredible stereo system, but he was a walking encyclopedia of the history of classical recordings of the 20th century. He had absolutely everything. And I remember him saying to me one day, you don't just listen to one piece before you come and play with us. You need to listen to as many recordings as possible, because you don't want to get stuck in one interpretation of it, because there's so many different interpretations. And he recommended so many great recordings to me. Tim did as well. Tim was another one. He had, thousands of records. And the other one was Lawrence Dobell, the principal clarinet. He was another one. He was extremely supportive to me when I first started there. He came up to me after I did my first audition. I didn't know who he was. And he complimented me. And the fact that he just took his time to come up and say, well done, I thought you played very well at the audition the other day. I didn't get the job, but I did enough to get a contract out of it. But it was easy. I couldn't believe that I was just what I felt like I was just this nobody that come from the brass band world, who was being actually embraced as one of their colleagues. And I'll never forget it. It was the best possible apprenticeship one could ever have as an orchestral musician. But they took a chance with me. I did my best to not let them down ever. And I knew how well prepared I needed to be there, because they were tough judges as well. They weren't going to, to say, yeah, good on you, mate, sounds great, if they didn't actually think it. You remember.
I do. I do.
And they had, and the older generation, they had an impeccable work ethic, and they had an impeccable professional ethics, fully. Clary Melba, when he came to work, he looked $1 million. He was dressed to go on the stage when he got out of the car park. Woodsy was the same, except he was coming from the railway station. And they always looked terrific.
It's good. It's actually really one of the things I've been loving about doing these interviews is it does give us the chance to remember people who were influential to us. And all of the people that you've mentioned were also hugely supportive and kind to me in my own journey. But this one's about you, Fabian. And so I want to leave Sydney now, because I've got a feeling that all of your colleagues in Melbourne are going to watch this and they're going to say, well, what about us? So you were...
Well, no, you wanted to do it semi-chronologically. That's what
and so now we're going to get to your stint in the Melbourne Symphony. But before that, I'd like to talk about, because you've told me that you had lessons from Frank Barzyk when you were preparing for the audition in Orchestra Victoria. So maybe you can talk to us about your relationship with Frank and what it was like learning from and being around him.
Well, he didn't coach me for the Orchestra Victoria job. My first meeting was with him, and I'd only known him by reputation. And people said to me, you try and meet him. He's really such a wonderful human being, but a magnificent player. And he's probably, between him and Peter Wish-Wilson, the two best tuba players in Australia. And I knew Wish already from when I was introduced to him in '87. He came up to do a Petrushka just a few months before I played in the orchestra. And so this name, Frank Barzyk, kept on popping up. So I made contact with him, and I said, well, I'd really love to get some lessons from you. And I've starting with SSO next month. This was in January. Would you have any time in late January for me to come down and have some lessons? I wanted to stay for a week or so, and he says, of course, I've got nothing on to do at the moment, and I'm more than happy to do this. And so I drove down with a friend of ours, John Sater, just down from Sydney to Melbourne. Took the trip and took a hotel, and I had lessons with Frank every day. And I'll never forget the genuine care and the camaraderie, the support, the generosity of human spirit that he straight away, I mean, he was one of the most gentle, loveliest people that I've ever met in my life. And there was no histrionics, there was no airs and graces there, anything. He was just a thoroughly decent, beautiful human being. I don't know what else to say. But as a musician, he simplified things. His explanation of technical aspects of breathing, of the intake and the expiration of the breath, and about playing in a relaxed state. And he'd incorporated some of his Tai Chi techniques into his brass playing, and he shared those with me. And for quite some years, believe it or not, Geoff, I actually would apply these things in my practice routine. And that, but the long, sustained, incredibly soft tones where it's virtually inaudible, like the equivalent of the 60-second bow. 60-second up bow. It's the same sort of principle in that, but expelling the air in the most controlled way, as slow as possible, where there's barely any sound. It was great for your soft playing. There was no doubt about that. It really helped me with soft playing. But by trying to relax the limbs and your body while you're doing this, it was a meditative state to play a brass instrument. And you'd be able to articulate this far more eloquently than me, given your background in martial arts and the rest. But certainly for somebody who'd never had any exposure to this before, Frank taught me about making the most beautiful sound as possible with the minimum amount of effort, which is something Michael always talks about as well.
That's fairly eloquent as far as I'm concerned. I don't think I could say it much better than that. So my timing was that. So you had those lessons with Frank before. So maybe
January 88.
So maybe it is time to go down to Melbourne, where we are now, and to talk a little bit about your experiences. You were in OV first before MSO, weren't you?
Yeah, only for about 2 years, actually. Okay,
so maybe some of the highlights of your tuba playing career. Actually, I do want to talk about something I've wanted to ask you about, your experience in it used to be called the concerto competition, in the young performers competition. And that connects to Frank, because Frank very proudly had the recording of that, and he played it for me in Zurich. Frank was a huge fan of your playing. And so that was the John Williams tuba concerto, I believe. So maybe when was that?
That's really high praise. And coming from him, my interactions with him were just always so brief, and I didn't know what he thought of my playing, and I mean, I certainly I rated him as high as I could possibly rate any brass player in Australia. He was really one of the best. There's no doubt about it. And I hadn't spoken to him for years, because we all know that he got sick in the early 90s, and he stopped playing, and he was working with his wife. And a business, was it in Newcastle or somewhere outside? Somewhere in New South.
Yeah, somewhere up there, yeah.
And we'd lost contact. We hadn't spoken for some time. I'd taken the job in OV, and I'd already started in the MSO. So I'll go back to that in a minute. But I don't want to forget about this, because it's important. It was the closest I came to reconnecting to you, because I rang his mum. I'd heard he just won the audition for the Zurich Opera. And I thought, I've got to get in contact with him, because I thought, this is amazing. He's been ill. I mean, I thought the word on the street that he was terminal, and he had overcome this. And I thought, if anybody could overcome this, of course Frank would. And then he wins the job in Zurich, and I thought, what a great story! This is fantastic. So I rang his mum in Prahran, and I asked how I could get in contact with him, and she had a contact phone number. And she said, he's in Zurich at the moment, and give him a call. And so I did, and he answers the phone. And of all people, he's staying at your place. We haven't had any contact for 7 years at that point. So actually, was it 7? What year was it? Was it 98, 99? It
was 98 that he got the job, yeah.
It was 98. Yep. Okay, so 98. And I rang him, and it was the first time we'd spoken on the phone in years. And he tells me he's staying at your place. And I mean, that was spooky in itself. And we had a rather lengthy conversation. And back in those days, you remember, it cost a fortune to call overseas, but I didn't care. I was just happy to sit on the phone with him. And at least I'm so glad that I got the opportunity, not knowing that he was going to pass away so soon, that to thank him for all the help he gave me, and for being such a great inspiration and such a wonderful colleague. I didn't know he was going to die, no, but none of us did. He certainly didn't. Maybe he had an inkling Who knows? But at least I'm so glad that I was able to show in some small way my gratitude for him as being a colleague, as being as a musician, as a fellow human being. And it was not so long before you and I reconnected again.
That's right.
But we'll get to that a little bit later if you like to.
Yeah, maybe in the sister interview.
Exactly.
So tell me about the John Williams. What was the genesis of that? Like, how did you come to be even playing that piece? Because I don't even remember which orchestra that was with. I just remember Frank showing me the recording of it.
Well, the Young Performers was something that I obviously knew a lot about, because when I was in the SSO, we played at the final for it. It used to be broadcast on the ABC live. I played in a few that was when the finals with the MSO, and everyone in the business knew about the Young Performers competition. I'd never entered it before. I'd never played it in a competition after I'd left the brass band world. And there were two reasons why I applied for it. One was because I was almost at the cutoff age. I think the cutoff age was, you had to be under 30, and I was going to be 29 that year. So it was the last year I could do it. I'd never participated in it before. But the main reason I did was because I knew where the final was going to be. And it was with the Sydney Symphony.
Ah.
And I thought I would like to do a concerto with them. And I don't think I'm going to get invited just out of the blue to go and do a concerto with them. So I really wanted to do that. And this John Williams had written, quite a piece. He'd used some of the themes from of all things, Jabba the Hutt. And then he actually came up with a very, very lyrical and actually quite as far as tuba concerto goes, a very beautiful piece and very technically demanding. I think it had been written for the fellow who was with the tubas with the Boston Symphony, and I'd had a recording of it somehow that Steve Ross had given to me. And so I thought, why not? Well, I've only got one shot at this, but I really want to get into the final for it. And somehow I did. I got into the final for it. And it was with the SSO, and it was great to go back on the stage there. I mean, I'd finished with the orchestra 7 years before, but I used to play there every year as a deb.
Right.
For Steve, or to come up as number 2, or if he took some leave. And so I still felt a very healthy connection to the SSO, and I did maintain that until the year before I stopped playing. I would play there nearly every year. Did their 1995 European tour, so I still had a long association with the orchestra. I was well into the MSO at that stage, and it was the early days. I was having a terrific time with the MSO, but playing in that competition, I didn't enter it to thinking I'd have a chance of winning it whatsoever. It wasn't even about that. It was just all those things, playing with my old colleagues from the SSO. Last year I could do the competition, and that's so it happened. And so Frank, you only told me that recently, that Frank even had heard it. And so it means a lot if it got his vote of approval. Well, that means a hell of a lot.
He very proudly showed it to me. I remember when he moved into his place in Zurich, after he got his place with Kathy, it was one of the things he got out to show me. He very, very proudly showed it to me. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about your time in the MSO. What were some of the highlights of that time for you? 15 years, right?
Yep. Playing in the section with Geoff Payne was really a great honour. And having him at the top of the brass section and me at the bottom, I felt a real connection with him straight away. He'd had a brass band background, I had as well. He was one of the finest people that I've worked with. He was a great colleague. He was an incredibly humble person, and a really decent fellow. And he learned from Woodsy as well in terms of how to be a professional musician, because he was the third trumpet in the SSO back in the 70s. And he had played in Peter Walmsley's band. He loved Woodsy. He really loved him. And he had come in on the back of Gordon Webb. So Gordon Webb had only just finished, I think, just before Geoff had started. And I'm pretty sure that, actually, I'm not quite positive about this, whether Danny had started while Geoff was still there. It must have been close.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact. I'm gonna have Peter Wormsley on to do an interview later on. I'm sure he'll be able to clear all of that up for us.
Oh, he's got a very good memory for these things. Yeah, he does. But Geoff, look, it was just fabulous to be in a section with him, and I mean, great sound, very different to Danny, very different, and that he had a beautiful lyrical sound, and his when he played French repertoire particularly, and then whenever we played any Debussy. Ravel, there was something about Geoff's playing. He had a real empathy for that. He was fascinated by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He used to talk to me about the little stories about when their rehearsals were generally spoken in French because of Anselme and who else? Who was the
Munch?
Exactly. Yeah. So he there was something about the French repertoire where he had a real affinity with, and hearing him play the Tomasi Concerto when he recorded that years later. I think that supports that claim of mine as well, because I think his Tomasi's is one of the great recordings of the piece. Him playing a Mahler symphony. I remember when we did Mahler 8 in Melbourne at the Royal Exhibition Building, and Hochen was in the audience. He was playing with the orchestra the following week, and afterwards at a social function, Hochen was very generous. He said, "Hearing Geoff Payne you're not going to hear it any better in the world." It was
actually told me about that performance when I saw him in Europe. He was raving about that performance.
Yeah, well, Geoff was absolutely on fire that night. It was just terrific, and there was a great camaraderie in our brass section with the trumpet guys, with Geoff's wife Julie, Bill Evans, who's been one of my dear friends for a long time as well, who I played in a brass quintet with for years, and then later on when Tristram Williams came into the section, and he's been one of my best friends for ever since he started in the orchestra. Maybe not the first week. We didn't. I was a little bit suspicious of him when he first started. He knows that. But immediately after that, we got that out of the way, and then I thought, no, this guy's great, just terrific. And so it was a hell of a team. Actually, Barry McKim as a composer before that as well. And that he was quite a character. And the trombones had been together as a section for a very long time. And they're all of the same generation, except for Ken was a little bit older. I got all in my first few years with the orchestra. I was happy to know that, well, as far as I could tell, I got on with everybody. As a tuba player, you're in your own section. It's an isolating position, so it's not in your interest to have any difficulty with those on your right. But it was sort of straightforward. Eric Clay and I, in the 15 years, never had one single crossword. Ian Perry was just one of the most fabulous colleagues, such an inspiration to the students that he had over the years, and really a great partner in crime. We used to practice together as well. He supported me in so many of my ventures over the years, and in the first few years there, it was particularly happy times. Not to mention those outside the brass section as well, and so I learned a lot from string players over the years. Particularly my friends that played string instruments. And as a conductor, if you don't understand the strings really, really well, you got no business being there.
Forget it.
If you don't understand the violin, forget it. There's a third of them, and if they will be onto you in a second, and that's it. Forget it. There's no point. And as Gelmetti once said in a conducting masterclass, if you can't add to what the orchestra can already do, you have no business being there. They don't even need you. So you have to be able to add. If you can't add to what they can do, leave it to somebody else who can, or just get the proverbial together. But anyway, early days with the MSO, the standout concerts, they're easy. Marius Janssen's conducting Mahler 5. First rehearsal started from the beginning, went right to the end. We had our break. He came back and he spoke succinctly and specifically about what he wanted us to do in terms of the phrasing of the first movement. He did one movement at a time. He left the fourth movement until we finished the fifth, and so he rehearsed that with the strings and the harp after we'd gone. But I stayed to watch that. I wanted to see how he dealt with it. He conducted the piece differently every single night, but not because, and in a highly disciplined way. He wanted to be fresh. Every single performance, we did 3 of them. Skrovichevsky did Bruckner 8 with us. It was my first Bruckner 8. Loved every minute of it. And he had a very lyrical approach to this piece, and he didn't, and he wanted it. He worked constantly at taking the aggression out of the attack, and
Fabian, it has been a real thrill talking to you about all of your different phases as a conductor, as an educator, and as a tuba player. I do have one final question for you. And this has been inspired. I've had my other normal question I ask, and this is now one of the first times I'm asking this question. And what music would you like to have played at your funeral?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've thought about that from time to time over the years. There was a period I became really obsessed with Beethoven because obviously I never got to play any of it. And in the late 90s, I started to listen to a lot of Beethoven, and it became a big obsession. I mean, to be honest with you, Geoff, the only things you can conduct for the rest of your life are if you had your pick by composers, there's no doubt it would be Beethoven and Brahms. That's for me. That is personally that is the music that that takes my attention. When I have the opportunity, if someone says, "Oh, this is on, what would you like to do?" First thing I'm going to propose is a Beethoven or Brahms symphony. And maybe because of my brass roots, the key of B flat comes to mind. So the Fourth Symphony, but not for funeral music. I went to a funeral once and they were playing the second movement of Beethoven 7, and the poignancy of that was really deeply affecting. But the B flat major, the third movement of Beethoven 9 was something that I really loved. That really said it all to me. And theme and variations, B flat major, my old brass band days. You get it where I'm coming from. But
I do.
Then there's other times where perhaps the something like some of the quieter sections from Daphnis, but that's a little bit. That's probably, I'm not going to play that at my funeral. And that's so. What I have played at my funeral? There's various songs, by Nat King Cole that come to mind, and or maybe Im Abendrot from the 4 last songs. But I think maybe just a simple song. Don't talk about me when I'm gone. Maybe that'll be it.
Well said. Fabian, an absolute pleasure. I'm going to say farewell to our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geoff. And I'm very much looking forward to interviewing you later.